Happy New Year.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm very
Okay, good morning.
Good
Morning and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
As I said in my message, New Year, good opportunity to start something new. And so after the last class, there is almost universal demand for switching to back to the basics using Brother Cho's book. So from here on forward, I will be going through Brother Cho's book in detail. All right, in detail, back to the basics in detail. I will hopefully today, though maybe not, get through the first paragraph. I mean, just give you an idea of how much detail we're planning to go into. So the sorry? Okay, let's just test. Can everybody hear me? People on the Zoom call hear me?
Yes.
I've got a normal large voice, so. Is it okay? So it's okay, all right, so all right, good. Now, sounds like it works. So as I mentioned, I'll be going through in some detail Brother Cho's notes. I'll be using Brother Cho's notes as a guide and then pick out specific words or specific concepts and expand on them. Now, I am sure that that's what Brother Cho did in his class as well. But the things that I talk about are probably going to be complementary. We probably won't cover exactly the same things. All right, even though we're working from the same notes. Now, as you know, the book is available hard copy here, many copies. Also, there's a soft copy available. It's been shared a few times. So please follow along in hard or soft copy. In addition, you will see that on my slides, I cut and paste portions of the book. So we can follow on the slides as well. And the people who watch the Zoom will be able to also see the words I'm talking about. Now, Brother Cho's book, he structured it into 4 divisions. There is an introduction division. There is the second division is on the 4 Noble Truths. The third division is on abhihamma. And the 4th division is on meditation. So let's go through a high-level overview of what is in each of those divisions, just to give you an idea of what we will be covering in the next, quite frankly, probably more than a year to get through this book. But we're lucky to get through it in 1 year. So in the first part of the introduction, we're going to understand the basics, go through the basic doctrine and principles of Theravada Buddhism, the life of the Buddha. Those are the key basics that we'll be covering in the first section. Then, ethical and social conduct. We're going to be doing a deep dive into Mahamangala Sutta, the Sigalavada Sutta, Kalama Sutta. These suttas are chosen by Brother Cho because they focus on lay people, on us. They're not focused on deep meditation. They're not focused so much on meditators. They're not focused so much on monks. They're focused on ethical and social principles for lay people. Then we will go into the role of the triple gem, again, for lay people, talking about the Buddha, the qualities of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, And here, we'll look into, do a deep dive into the Ratana Sutta. So this is the first part of the first division. The second division, the Four Noble Truths, looks at suffering and its nature. Now, suffering is an important term in Buddhism. We often talk about suffering. It's the first noble truth, noble truth of suffering. But what do we mean by suffering and how do we relate to it? There's actually three kinds of suffering, according to Pali. Okay? The first kind of suffering they call dukkha. Suffering. This is the conventional type of suffering. For example, I stubbed my toe, that's pain. Or I'm frustrated at work, that is mental pain. All right? We face that all the time. We're sick. We have a pain in our leg or in our knee, in our stomach, whatever. That is dukkha. What do the suttas say about that? The Buddha gave a very important sutta called the Dark Sutta, where he talked about the difference between an enlightened person and a lay person on how they deal with pain. The enlightened person feels the physical pain. It's like being hit by a dart. The unenlightened person, the lay person, it's like getting hit by two darts. The first dart, the physical pain, the second dart is mental pain, continuing to suffer. So, for example, I mentioned dukkha. One of the examples I gave was frustrated at work. Okay, fine, you're at work. Somebody, your boss treats you badly. That is suffering. But then the problem is that we add on top of that initial suffering more and more and more. We take it home with us. We complain to our spouse. We dwell on it. All right. That extra mental suffering is stuff that we add on ourselves. So what the Buddha is teaching us is the best way to deal with dukkha is cut it off with just the initial suffering. Yes, it's painful. But after that, let it go. Don't add mental suffering to physical suffering, or don't add more mental suffering to the initial mental suffering. And I experienced this with meditating. When meditating, sometimes there's a pain that arises, maybe in the leg or somewhere, usually in the leg. All right, so pain arises. Rather than, oh, why am I so painful? I just want to move my leg. This kind of adding more mental suffering on top of that physical suffering. What meditation teachers will tell you is note the pain, observe the pain, look at the nature of the pain. Is it a twisting pain? Is it a pulling pain? Is it a hard pain? And watch it change. Take it as an object that you're interested in. Pain becomes a fantastic object because it grabs the attention. It grabs your attention like nothing else. Sometimes watching rising, falling gets boring, but pain grabs your attention. I remember when my wife shared with me a story when she was first learning meditation. She approached the meditation teacher and said, "Oh, I have pain." The meditation teacher said, "Look, imagine your last thought moment. Do you think you'll be comfortable? There's a good chance you're going to be in pain." Now, here in the meditation center, think of what you're doing is a dress rehearsal for your last thought moment. If you can deal with pain in a wholesome way, rather than obsessing on it and getting all upset about it, now there's a better chance that when you're feeling pain in your last thought moment, you can deal with it in a proper way. So, dukkha, the first type of suffering, be aware of it and don't get attacked. Don't stick to it. Whether it's physical suffering like pain in your leg or mental suffering like frustration with your work, don't take it home with you. Leave it. That's the how in the real world or in daily life, Buddhism teaches us to deal with the first kind of suffering. The second type of suffering, abhihamma suffering, dukkha, abhihamma dukkha, is suffering because of change. So, when the thought arises, oh, I used to be young, I'm not young anymore. That's suffering. I used to be healthy, I'm not healthy anymore. This relationship broke up. I lost so much money in the stock market. All of this is pain because of change. And the root cause of that is you were obsessed with your youth, your health, your beauty, your money. You were obsessed or focused on that before. And so when it goes, as it naturally will, it causes you pain. So the way to deal with that kind of pain, the pain of change, is to practice detachment. Don't be obsessed with things. Don't be overly attached. And as a parent, I can tell you, being attached to a child is natural. But they're going to grow up and live their own lives. They've got their own life, their own karma, and they're going to do things that you don't necessarily agree with. And that's going to cause you pain. That's the nature. That's its nature. Change is its nature. So, what the suttas tell us is how to deal with change, the pain of change, is not being attached to things. Okay? Not being infatuated with things. I'm choosing my words carefully because infatuation is something that comes up again and again in the suttas that we'll cover when we dive into suttas. The third type of pain, okay, so the first one is dukkha, physical pain. Viparanama dukkha, which is the pain due to change. The third kind of pain is called sankhara dukkha, only experienced by meditators. When it becomes obvious to the meditating mind that all these things that we cling to as a foundation, as a platform, these five aggregates have no substance to them. They arise and fall away instantly. It's like there's nothing underneath your feet, nothing supporting you. This is a existential pain, pain related to existence. This is critical to get through in the insight knowledges. One must face this pain and go through this in various insight knowledges. The terror, it's called the knowledge of terror, the knowledge of abandonment, so many different knowledges, all the way up to the getting over it, where one is neutral, Sankaropeka Jnana, where the knowledge of neutral to all this change that's going on. And the change here is of conditioned things, specifically the body, the five aggregates. So we'll be talking about suffering and its nature. We will talk about the cause of suffering. The cause of suffering, as we know, is tanha and ignorance, avijja. So we'll go through the dependent origination here in some detail. And when we discuss the cause of suffering, it naturally leads to the fourth noble truth, the path to liberation. One sutta I will spend some time on is, we're all familiar with the 12 links of dependent origination. Okay, this leads to that, leads to that, leads to that, leads to that. Okay, great. But there's also an extension to that, which takes us on the path to liberation, take us away from samsara. And I'll give you a hint. The first step in that path away from samsara is contemplating pain, suffering, dukkha. the nature of suffering. Okay, so we'll talk about the Eightfold Noble Path, the step-by-step progress through the Noble Eightfold Path. So those are the first two sections, two divisions of the class, Brother Teo's class notes. The third section is on Abhidhamma. Each of these four sections are roughly the same length. The third section on Abhidhamma, we're doing an analysis of mind and matter, Nama and Rupa. Nama will be broken into consciousness or Tika, Chetasikas, or the mental factors. Matter is Rupa, introduce the Buddhist perspective on matter, contrast it with the scientific perspective on matter. This will lead to a discussion of karma and rebirth. From my experience, every year, this is the topic that gains the most interest, karma and rebirth. Still a lot of questions and discussion on karma and rebirth. We will then go through the thought process, how there is thinking without a thinker, seeing without a seer, all of the, how sensing and thinking arise without a self behind them. What is the automatic process? And what are the key points in that process that we can intervene and direct to wholesome karma versus unwholesome karma? So we'll talk about that. The last division is meditation, where I will talk about the four foundations of mindfulness, go through the subject in some detail. I will contrast samatha meditation and vipassana meditation. Samatha meditation being the steadying, calming, tranquilizing aspect of the mind, leading to absorption or jhanas. Vipassana, wisdom, leading to enlightenment. Then overcoming defilements, different ways of overcoming defilements. There is the taking precepts. There is the temporarily suppressing them through samatha. And then there is permanently uprooting them through vipassana. We'll talk about all those. So that's kind of an overview of the entire text. Now, it was prepared by Brother Teo, and I just want to share a couple of personal experiences I had with Brother Teo. It was almost, not quite, almost 30 years ago that I had finished my Introduction to Buddhism for Adults class that was being held in the Pagoda. Uncle Thom gave that class, long since passed away, but he gave a very good introduction. And after that, like all the other parents in that group, because we all have kids in the Sunday school, the question was, all right, so now what? Some of those parents went on to become Sunday school teachers. Some of them volunteered and helped around the temple. And some of them wanted to learn more. And I was in the I want to learn more, and I heard about this Abhidhamma class. And so I went into this Abhidhamma, Brother Teo's Abhidhamma class. And he was using as a text Bhikkhu Bodhi's recently published book, The Comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma. It had come out a few years earlier. We spent an hour, hour and a half on one paragraph. And I went home and I said to my wife, brought the kids home, said to my wife, oh, I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about, but boy, I was interested. I'm going to go back next week. And so I did. And for 5 years, I made sure I sat up in front, I listened very carefully, took lots of notes, went back and did all sorts of research on my own. And after 5 years, Brother Teo said that he was looking for a volunteer because he wanted to kind of reduce his workload, only teach every second week, because it takes a lot of work to prepare a class. So immediately my hand shot up. Now, volunteering is good, right? Volunteering to teach the Dhamma. However, there was an ego behind it, right? You know, I was thinking, hey, I think I can do a good job, not better than Brother Teo, but I think I can do a good job at that. I want to give it a try. And then when teaching, I would really prepare hard. Why? I was afraid of looking like a fool when if a question came up that I wasn't prepared for. So you see, there was ego, there was fear as motivators to do good things, to teach that class. So don't get, as the lesson that I want to deliver here is, even though they may be unwholesome thoughts, they can motivate wholesome behavior. So I took over the alternate class with Brother Joe and did that for 15 years. About 15 years. Then I retired from my day job and decided I wanted to meditate. So I retired from teaching, and for almost 10 years I focused on meditation because I tried a bit going to the retreat center and coming back on the Sunday to teach the class. Very disruptive to meditation. So I gave it up for almost 10 years. Then I heard that Brother Kyo was not well about a year ago, and so I volunteered to come back. These days I'm spending quite a bit of time in Australia. I'll be here for another couple of months, but then back to Australia. So Brother Kyo has been a great influence on me, and so I'm really honored to continue on using his book, his class notes, as the basis for my my talks here. So, any questions on what I've talked about so far? This kind of quick introduction stuff. Okay. We're going to now go through the first paragraph. I'm going to read it first. You can. Theravada Buddhism offers the original doctrines of the Buddha Gautama to those who wish to learn more about the Buddha, or more about the Buddha and his teaching. These doctrines. Oh, I'm getting ahead of me. Well, how do you get rid of that? This?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Theravada Buddhism offers the original doctrines of the Buddha Gautama to those who wish to learn more about the Buddha and his teaching. These doctrines in the Pali Canon are regarded as the words of the Buddha, Buddha Vachana, by the school of elders, Theravada. All right, that's the first paragraph. We're going to go through some words here. The first word, Theravada. Okay, so I've highlighted the first word, Theravada. I went to Wikipedia and I said, what are the early Buddhist schools? And it gave me this list. And I organized them in this order, but these are the early Buddhist schools according to Wikipedia. Now, if you look through the names, the only one that you'll recognize is Theravada. The rest of these, you've never heard of before. Why? Because they don't exist anymore. They don't exist as separate schools anymore. The other main school that, of course, we've all heard of is Mahayana. Where does Mahayana fit into this? Well, the Mahayana actually evolved quite a bit later. All right, as texts came into China, or first it rose in India as a much later school to this, and then it moved into China. So what we currently call Mahayana in China is a mixture of multiple of these schools. The Vinaya rules for the monks and nuns in China is taken from the Dharmakutta school. They took that one. The basic teachings of a Buddha who is like a god or supramundane, who's transcendent, constantly forever existing, multiple Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas and Bodhisattva path, all that comes from the Mahasangika school. And the more detailed study, the Yogacara school of the metaphysics, comes from the Sarvastivada, Abhidharma. So they grab in China, it's a mixture of Sarvastivada, Dhamma Mahasamhika, and of course, over the 1,500 years it's been evolving in China, there have been changes and adaptations. So the schools that we have, okay, so just to give you just on the highlights of this. The Buddha originated in India, of course, and had his teachings about 100 years, rather, 100 years after the Buddha's parinibbana. There was a argument between two groups of monks. The group of monks who were in the east part of India and those who are on the west part of India. The ones on the east part of India, Mahasamhika, they were the majority of monks. Maha, the great Sangha, they were the majority. Srata Viradvada, I'm not very bad at Sanskrit names. That they were in the minority, and this is the Srata, sorry, Srata is an elder in Sanskrit. Okay? So this is these were the elders. These are the ones that focus more on the arahats. These focus on bodhisattvas and all of the amazing aspects of the Buddha as being like a god. Right? Within this group, the Theravada, they're an interesting group. This is the person school. Okay? They said we don't believe what the others are saying, that this the person is an illusion. Okay, we say there's no soul. They agree there's no soul, but it's not. The person is not an illusion. It's a conventional reality, and that conventional reality has importance when it comes to explaining karma and rebirth. So it's the conventional self that is reborn. And of course, the other Buddhists, the other group, the other school said, no. You are trying to introduce soul into Buddhism. But that group has fallen away. The Vajrayana, that means the school of analysis. These are the people that did the serious detailed analysis. And among those, Theravada is the group in Sri Lanka that went to Sri Lanka, and the Pali word for elder is Thera. So Thera is elder, Vada is school. Sarvastivada, the Sarva is the Sanskrit word for everything. Asti is exists. Vada is school. So this is the everything exists school. Their idea, this may sound a little weird, is that karma from the past influences the present, so therefore it has a kind of existence now. And I can imagine the future, so therefore the future has a kind of existence now. So the past, the present, and the future all exist at the same time. Everything exists. That was their philosophy. That's why they're called the Sarvastivada. And they built up a whole very elaborate abhidharma that fortunately, because it was brought into China, translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, it's available now. It's been translated, much of it has been translated into English now. So we can compare this abhidharma with our abhidharma. They don't look anything like. They're completely different philosophies. They're based on the same 10,000 suttas, but the Sarvastivada abhidharma, the fundamental principle is everything exists always. In the past, the present, the future exists. So there's some very different ideas among all these schools. But today, we're only going to be focusing on the Theravada group. Okay. So, any questions on this Yeah.
What happened to all other schools? Has the teaching disappeared? Or is there any record or anything that can actually trace back to this teaching?
Okay, where did all those schools, what happened to them all? Obviously, the fact that Wikipedia is able to make this list, they must have some documents. And there are partial documents on many of the schools. Okay, more complete on the Sarvastivada, when it was imported into China, for example. They translated a whole bunch of this stuff. Some Sotranika was done. A lot of this stuff was translated. And so they were able to have fragments. And then also one school talks about another school, right? Even in the Theravada tradition, there is a book called the Book of Controversy. It's actually one of the 7 texts of the Abhihamma. And it talks about the points of controversy. Says, here is the Theravada view, and here is the heretic view, the others. And it said, the Pugalavadas say this group says this group says that. Okay. Now,
The slides.
slides aren't progressing. Okay. Okay, so the Theravada has a text that compares our Abhidhamma has a text of the points of controversy that compares. There's also other people who compare themselves with different groups. In fact, I've got a very interesting book at home that compares the Vinaya from 15 different schools. All right. Now, the Vinaya, the rules for the monks and nuns, that they've got to recite in unison every 15 days, twice a month. You'd think that it kind of would remain the same because they only got to remember these set of rules. No. You'll see interesting variation, and they give an analysis of why certain rules went to certain schools, and maybe it was a misinterpretation because of language, all sorts of things. So all of these schools are referenced by each other, and there are portions of texts. The only ones where we have a complete set, Theravada, and to a lesser extent, the Sarvastivada, and Mahasangika, and the Dhammagupta. And I say a lesser extent is because it's what was brought into China and translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, and then maintained in China. Okay. Other question? Okay. Now, we're going to go into a fairly long discussion about this word original, because in Theravada they often say, oh yeah, we got the original ones. Well, not exactly. Not exactly. What are the texts we're talking about? 2,500 years ago, there were the suttas from the time of the Buddha. Rough, these are all rough dates, right? The Abhidhamma Pitaka, the original 7 volumes, they probably started, the oldest parts of them probably started around the time of the Buddha as explanations, like commentaries at the time of the Buddha. But then they evolved over time into what we currently have as the Abhidhamma Pitaka about 2,000 years ago. Now dates get a little bit more firm. Buddhaghosa wrote the Visuddhimagga, compiled the commentaries from texts that had existed from the time of the Buddha, and compiled them around 400, 430 AD. The Abhidhamma Sangaha, about 800 years ago, was written as a manual for young monks to memorize the Abhidhamma. And then in the last 150 years, lots and lots of modern texts have been written. But each set of texts builds on the material found in the earlier texts. So it's like layer. Every layer builds on the previous underlying layers, expands on it, maybe takes it in a slightly different direction. But we can peel back the onion and get to the core, which are the sutras. The problem is like 10,000 of these in Theravada tradition and more in Mahayana. But there's about 10,000 sutras. And so to get their head around that, they need a structure. This is what the Abhihamma provided, is a structure to consolidate all of the 10,000 sutras into one framework. But if you were to take, say, 5 people in this room and made them all, they were all brilliant scholars, and they all had 20 years or 50 years of time. And you gave them the same 10,000 texts and said, summarize these into a framework. 5 people working independently. You think they come up with the same thing? No way. You'd have 5 different summaries, right? 5 different summaries. So different schools, especially if they all came from a slightly different perspective. So each of the early schools had their own abhihamma, but they were lost. The only existing ones that remain today are the Theravada and the Sarvastivada. The other ones don't exist anymore. So each set of texts builds upon the material found in the earlier ones. So also the same timeline. The first council held at the time of the Buddha. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. First just after the Buddha's parinirvana. The purpose was to consolidate all the texts. Second council was 100 years later. That's the one I mentioned, where the Mahasanghika broke away from the other school of elders. The third council, King Ashoka, very important, because this is when Buddhism really got its footing in India, because it got royal support. Fourth council in Sri Lanka, where there was a threat of losing the Tipitaka, so they wrote it down. The monks wrote it down. Why was there a threat of losing it? Well, in Sri Lanka, they started out at the time of Asoka with Theravada. And it dominated. The Theravada dominated for 250 years. Then the king in Sri Lanka said, you know what? These monks got a lot of power. I need to keep them under control here. So he went to India next door and brought in the Abhihamma school, another school that was more Mahayana oriented. And that got royal patronage. So that they saw the existing monks at the time of the fourth council with threat from the king, threat from these new monks coming in with their own teachings. They ran away to a cave away from the capital and wrote down the texts. Yeah, okay, I actually visited, very nice. By the time it was time for the Siddhimata to be written, around 400 years later, by that point, the Abhihamma had taken over most of Sri Lanka. There was a Chinese tourist named Fashian who showed up and wrote down, a Buddhist tourist wrote down what he found, and he said around this time, 30% of the monks are from Theravada, Mahavihara. The rest, most of the rest are from Abhihamma. There's a new school called Theravada, but basically also heavily influenced by Mahayana. So there was another school. There were the only school that Theravada was only 30%. So this was a motivation for Buddhaghosa to build up. They were, being boxed into a corner already. They didn't have royal support, they still didn't have royal support. So they needed a really strong text, consolidate all their teachings. And that's where the Sutta and the Theravada commentaries came from. Right, so just to give you a bit of context. Well, another 600 years later, the Mahavihara group kicked out the others and took over Sri Lanka again. Right? Now, here's another kind of an interesting comparing different religious leaders. The Buddha was more or less roughly contemporary with Confucius, with Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu, well, I'm not really sure whether Lao Tzu really existed or not, but they placed him roughly around the same time as Confucius. Mahavira. Now, Mahavira is the founder of the Jain religion. And in the suttas, the Buddha talks about him on a couple of suttas. They called him Iganta Nataputta. They said, and in these couple of suttas, what happened was one of the Buddhist followers came back to the Buddha and said, hey, Iganta Nataputta has died. And his followers are now arguing about who should lead after this. How are we going to avoid the same kind of problem when you are in Iran? And the Buddha said, let the Dhamma be your guide. We need to start getting together, reciting together important parts of the texts. This is from the Sangiti, reciting together Sutta, Sangiti Sutta, in the Nikaya. So this is what motivated this reciting of texts together, even at the time of the Buddha, because the Buddha recognized that he didn't want to hand it over to Sariputta or anybody else when he passed along. Now, just interesting point about Mahavira. His father's name was Siddhartha. His chief disciple, the one that consolidated his teachings, was Gautama. So the names of Siddhartha and Gautama were pretty common in India at that time. Just like, for example, the name Jesus, very, very common at that time in that location in Hebrew. So, and also roughly contemporary are Socrates and Plato. Why is it that all of a sudden some of the world's greatest thinkers arose roughly at the same time? Difficult to know. Who knows? But one of the things that they think is that society had moved from had started to build cities, away from being just purely agrarian, just farmers. When you start to get people in cities, now you can support scholars and people and ascetics. But why all of a sudden here and less afterwards? Who knows? Okay. Here is, this bar represents the presence of Buddhism in India. Now we know that Buddha lived in India. The first 250 years, it's dotted lines or dashed lines. Why? Because it was very small, little pockets here and there, not organized. Remember the 18 or all those different schools I showed on that earlier slide, right? All over the place. It wasn't until King Ashoka came and said, okay, actually, he's got an interesting story. He had just won this major battle. As he's walking along the battleground, seeing all these dead people, he said, what have I done? This is terrible. And so he became Buddhist after that, after winning this major battle. And he started supporting the Sangha and the mains, according to Theravada sources, it was the Theravada that he supported. So things started becoming consolidated because it got royal support. Once it became consolidated, then all sorts of people want to join. all sorts of different ideas, it gets watered down and distorted, and so you've got to clean up the Sangha. And actually, King Ashoka, he left these written records on stone, the pillars, about what all of his accomplishments. And one of the things he did, according to his accomplishments, is cleaned up the Sangha. So he organized a group to clean up and purify, kick out the people who had wrong views. All right. So actually, in the written history of India, this is the first time when you have actually archaeological evidence that they can actually point to stones and say, oh, okay, this is written down. This is what happened. So King Ashoka consolidated, and then around 400 AD, around the time the City Bible was done, that's when Nalanda University was formed. By that time, India had switched from Theravada focus to Mahayana focus. And so around 400 AD, Nalanda University became the thought center for Buddhism, specifically Mahayana Buddhism in India. And it was this kind of big university, big international university, lots of overseas students. And 300 years later, turned to Vajrayana Buddhism, and continued on until 1200 when it was destroyed. Buddhism was effectively wiped out of India for about 700 years, until midway through the 20th century, when, particularly due to the efforts of Ambedkar, brought it back as particularly for the lower caste Indians. A lot of politics and interesting stories behind that. But this is Buddhism in India. Now, Theravada starts in Sri Lanka, comes in from India, because one of the sons of King Ashoka, Mahinda, was a monk, came to Sri Lanka and introduced, as a missionary, introduced Theravada Buddhism, and it stuck in Sri Lanka around that time, and has been there since, on and off. Okay, this is a little bit misleading to have it all actually solid like this. There's a few times it got so weak, it had to go to Thailand or Burma to get other monks to come back and restart it in Sri Lanka. But basically, it's been more or less constant 250 BC. Now, at the same time that King Ashoka was sending out his son to Sri Lanka, sent another couple of monks to what he called Sunabhumi, which they think now is Burma or Thailand. And so it was partially introduced here in Burma, Thailand. Theravada was partially introduced. Mahayana also got introduced. Hinduism got introduced. But around 1,000 years ago, the king of Burma, the king of Thailand, fixed on Theravada, and it's been pretty solid since then. Again, pretty solid. You don't want to get into all the politics, but pretty solid. So, Mahayana Buddhism, it started out really around 300 AD through the Silk Road, because what was happening is monks started talking to the traders who were going between China and Europe along the Silk Road. And so Buddhism started going into China from India, but it was in little bits and pieces. They took a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And because there were so many schools, it didn't stick together. So what happened is they needed to pull it together and organize it. Help me out here. Pashman. No, not Pashman. Pashman was 400. Sichuan, yes. 400 years, yeah. So Sichuan, he was in Xi'an, was the capital at that time, and there was a travel ban at that time. Not allowed to leave. Okay. But he left anyway and went across the desert, went across the mountains, and became the basis for the Journey to the West, because he was going westwards to collect the books. He was the monk in Journey to the West to collect the Buddhist scriptures. He spent a couple of decades at Nalanda. At Nalanda, he's studying, now by that time, it's purely Mahayana. He said he asked about, wait, what's Theravada? His compatriots said at the school, said, don't worry about that, we got their texts. It's all, no need going down there, we got the texts. And so he came back, brought back a huge amount of texts from Nalanda, and then spent a couple more, the rest of his life translating into Chinese. And that really solidified Mahayana in China. Okay, yes, there's still Confucianism and back and forth, but that's where Mahayana really started being consolidated in China. And then from China, of course, it goes to Korea and Japan. About 100 years, 150 years after Sangchuan, the king of Tibet said, okay, I'm going to become Buddhist. So he got some monks from Nalanda to introduce Buddhism, and they introduced Vajrayana. So Vajrayana and Mahayana are next door to each other, right? And so they're constantly influencing each other, whereas Theravada, they're like the family member who moved out a long time ago, very distant, not much connection anymore. So they don't influence much each other. So Mahayana, Vajrayana, a lot of cross influence over the centuries. Theravada, not so much influence, particularly because these guys were Sanskrit into Chinese, this is Sanskrit into Tibetan. These were Pali. Okay. So, any questions on what I've just covered here? All these different schools.
They're talking about original doctrine, but nowadays very popular. They're talking about early Buddhism or early Buddhist text.
Early Buddhist texts. Okay, where are the early Buddhist texts come in? Excellent. Right to my next slide. All right. You're right. Recently, there's been a lot of analysis. So imagine that you go to China and you take their texts, which have been translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, and you compare them to the Pali. Now, they were about 800 years difference, 900 years difference. You know, the Pali ones came first, right? But then they were maintained for 800, 900 years in India, and then pulled into China, right? Because it was 250 BC that the Theravada came to Sri Lanka, and it was 650 AD, 900 years later, that Mahayana went to China, solid. Okay, and you look at the two texts, both, and compare them, the translations of both of them. If you find stuff that is identical or almost identical, you go, you know what? This is probably from something that was even earlier, right? In both groups. If Theravada kept the same stuff, and Mahayana, 900 years later, kept the same stuff, it must have come from the same source. That is probably from early Buddhist, called the, and in Theravada, the scholars call it early Buddhist texts. Does not include the abhihamma. The suttas, from the suttas. So when the scholars talk about early Buddhist texts, they are talking about the stuff that matches. Now, it's almost never a perfect match. I mean, translation mistakes and slight rewording, but if it's almost the same message, it's considered to be an early Buddhist text from early Buddhism. The origin of that text was probably before 250 BC, before the time of Ashoka, because it was at Ashoka that they split, right? The Theravada went off, and then 900 years later, that Mahayana went off. So this is the early Buddhist texts the ones that are almost the same. Now, I will tell you, almost all or most of the Pali Suttas are considered early Buddhist texts. You can find parallel passages in the Chinese Agamas. So that is very reassuring to us that it is good. We've got early material. However, there was an interesting very thick two-volume set done by Analayo, where he took every sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, Theravada Majjhima Nikaya, and cross-referenced every single, not only the Mahayana ones, but all the Tibetan and other languages that they have found, dug up in Pakistan, Afghanistan, everything they dug up. He compared. And he said, okay, this part of this sutta is probably original, this part was added later, and da. So there are parts of suttas that are truly original, and they're studying that. Okay, based on linguistics and other things. So this is the early Buddhist text. But what if they don't match? What if you have something in the Pali Suttas and there is absolutely nothing like it in the Chinese Suttas? Now, it's possible that it's original and they lost it, or more likely, because these guys were very careful about keeping the texts, more likely it was added in Sri Lanka after it got there. And I'll give you an example. In Pali, we have the Karyana Metta Sutta, the Metta Sutta. There's nothing like that in Chinese. Okay, now that is not to say that the Buddha did not teach metta. Of course he taught metta. But perhaps not using the words of the Karyana Metta Sutta. It doesn't mean that it's not valuable for us to teach, to learn that and to follow it, but just be aware that the scholars say that this one might be a little bit added on later. Now, what about the other way around, where there's nothing in the Pali Suttas, but it exists in the Chinese Sutras? And there are most of the important Mahayana Suttas, the Lotus Sutra, Diamond Sutra, Heart Sutra. Nothing like that in Pali. What that suggests is that, and there is lots of evidence, scholarly evidence, that there were original versions written in India and then later enhanced in China. Okay, so they're not original teachings. The ones that are most likely closest to the original teachings, the early Buddhist texts, the ones where the Pali Suttas and the Chinese Sutras, the Nikayas and the Agamas agree. Okay. So I think I answered your question. Other questions? Oh, by the way, I will be posting these slides in the group, right? In the group chat, so no need to take photos. And the video will be posted as well, by Brother Albert, so you can watch and listen to me again if you want. All right, any other questions on this? Okay. Next, we're going to go to the word Pali. The Buddha spoke a Magadhi Prakrit. Pali is a literary form of Magadhi. Now, what is a Prakrit? Prakrit is like a dialect. All right, so you've got the spoken form, which is the dialect. Let me give you an example. English, right? You've got British English, you've got American English, you've got Malaysian English, Singaporean English. Well, technically they're all English, right? But the way we speak in each of those countries is a little different. A little bit different words, something, different pronunciation, some things are done differently. Okay, similarly, you had Sanskrit. Sanskrit was the official language used by the Brahmins to recite the Vedas. Everyone spoke a language similar to Sanskrit. All right, so there's different versions of it, of Sanskrit, and Pali is the literary form of Magadha. And Magadha is where the Buddha was born. So basically, he spoke the dialect from where he was born, as you would expect. Now, literary Pali remained relatively stable over time. In other words, the Pali received from the suttas and written hundreds of years later in the commentary, very, very similar. Spoken, evolved into other languages such as Bengali, right? Indian languages, so the Magadha evolved into other languages. I'll give you an example. There's another example that is similar to this. Latin, okay? There is the normal Latin, okay, the pure Latin, and then there was what was called the vulgar Latin. The vulgar Latin is what people spoke. The pure Latin is what people wrote. The pure Latin was kept for centuries. The vulgar Latin evolved into languages such as Spanish and Italian and French, right? What are called the Romance languages. But the pure Latin remained the same. So even up until the 1960s, the Catholic Church, the Mass was held in pure Latin. All right? But that wasn't the kind of Latin that people spoke, ever. The verbal form of Latin, the vulgar Latin, actually it got changed over time. Here's a very important point. It'll be a little bit controversial here. This is from the Denial. 2 monks approached the Buddha, suggesting that the Buddha's teachings should be taught in classical Vedic Sanskrit to lend a more formal and authoritative tone to the Dhamma. The Buddha rejected their proposal and instructed that the Dhamma should be taught in the local vernacular. Okay, I looked it up in the Vinaya, that's almost exactly what it says. These two Brahmins said, look, in our tradition, the Brahmin tradition, you gotta understand what was going on at the time. Brahmins their job from birth is to recite the Vedas. And according to their belief, every word had to be pronounced exactly correctly. If it's not pronounced exactly correctly, the ceremony is worthless. I'm exaggerating, but it's so important that you pronounce things properly. You have to use the right word, you have to pronounce it properly. So from childhood, this group, this whole caste of Brahmins were taught how to recite the Vedas properly. Now it's very, very important to them. Now some of these Brahmins became monks, and they brought up this idea that, hey, we should give the Buddha's teachings in Vedic Sanskrit. The Buddha said, no, do it in the local. Don't make it special, the language special. Now, 100 years ago from today, so what happened over the last 2,500 years, next 2,400 years? The Pali Tipitaka had not been translated into Sinhalese, had not been translated into Burmese, not been translated into Thai. So parts of it had. Like, for example, the first thing you're going to translate, of course, is the Dhammapada, right? The Dhammapada was first translated into Sinhalese about 800 years ago, to Burmese 400 years ago, into Thai 160 years ago. Before that, the only language it was available in is Pali. So it's only available to Pali, people who spoke Pali, who in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand spoke Pali. Some of the monks, not all, but only a few of the monks, some of the monks. So it became only them that could read the original. Nobody else could read the original. There were parts had been translated, but we're talking about the whole Tipitaka. Now, I mean, as a word of defense to these countries, 100 years ago, the literacy rate was about 30%, right? They're farmers, everybody's a farmer, right? They don't read or write, so it wasn't so critical. But 100 years ago, almost all the Tipitaka had been translated into English by the Polytech Society. In 1881, T.W. Rice Davis and his wife Caroline started this as a group of scholars from England, started this group to translate all the texts, because when they were visiting, or actually Rice Davis had spent time as a officer with the British in Sri Lanka, and he saw everything is just on leads and very fragile, it's going to be lost. We need to publish it. Right? We need to organize it and publish it. So he formed the Polytech Society and got a bunch of donations and scholars to work on this. So the first modern language that the entire Tipitaka was available in was English, not these languages. When did these languages come? 1950s, 1960s? All right, not that long ago. Not that long ago.
Today, there's Pali has been translated to Sinhalese, Burmese, and Thai.
Oh, yes, it's all available now. All available now. Oh, of course, yes. Oh, yeah, now it is. Now it has been. I'm talking about 100 years ago. But for 2,400 years of the Buddha's teaching, the only people that had access to it, the full teaching, were these scholar monks who spoke Pali. Right? So it was not being taught in the local vernacular. Now, there was an interesting story. About 800 years ago, there was a Sinhalese monk named Ananda, and he went to southern India. Okay? There's some problems in Sri Lanka, so he went to southern India. And so he's going into a society that doesn't know anything about Buddhism. So he decides to write a book, how to introduce Buddhism to adults for, people who haven't been encountering it before. I was reading and it was just recently translated into English. Now it's very interesting. And it talked about the precepts. Okay? What it said is, if you can recite the precepts in Pali, that's good. If you cannot do it in Pali, do it in your local language. And if you can't remember how to do it in your local language, just reflect to yourself, I undertake the precepts. So this is very interesting. It shows that the actual words used. Now keep in mind, he's going to southern India, right? Now southern India, the Tamil culture predates Sanskrit. The Tamil language, parts of it predates, not the same linguistic group as Sanskrit. So you've got the Brahmins, who are reciting the Vedas in Sanskrit, which is a completely different root language from Tamil. And so the people are expected to put great importance on the right words in Sanskrit, which is a completely foreign language to them. The Buddhists come over and say, don't worry about Sanskrit, don't worry about Tamil, don't worry about the language, don't worry about Pali. If you can remember it in Pali, that's perfect. If you can't, do it in your local language. If you can't, just reflect on it yourself. So I remember just now, Brother Alfred was asked, hey, what if we reciting in Pali? What if we can't remember? Can we do it in English? Absolutely. What's most important is what's in your heart. There's no magic in those Pali words. There's no magic in those Pali words. If you can do it in Pali, to me, reciting in Pali kind of tunes my mind. maybe it's from past existences or for whatever reason, it tunes my mind, it's a good thing. So I'm not saying it's useless, it helps me. But what's most important is the understanding what's in my heart. Actually, we're already over time. And we got through almost, yes.
I think it's translated Chinese too.
Has the whole Titicaca been
Yeah.
translated into Mandarin, Chinese?
Yeah, not
Yeah, Theravada. I don't know. I don't know if it has or not. It would not surprise me. It would not surprise me, but I have not. I will check. I'll see if I can find out. Okay. So, the most important thing about Pali is not, I mean, the whole thing about Buddhism is not so much the getting the words right or even being able to pronounce them properly. No, it is what's in your heart. If Pali makes your heart more spiritual, it does for me, that's great. Otherwise, read the English. And if you can't remember all, if some of the words in the English are messy for you, just get the meaning. Just get the real meaning and put the meaning in your heart. That's what's important. Okay. So any other questions? All right. Any questions from the online group, the people listening?
No, thank you.
Any questions? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. And so with that, we will close the class and ask someone to read the transfer of merits.
As closure of these sessions, we will now do a reflection. Let us recall to our mind this morning, we come to the temple with the sole purpose to study the Dhamma. With good faith, saddha, and wise attention, sati, we learn and understand some of the Lord Buddha's teaching. Whenever there is any doubt or wrong understanding of the teaching, we seek to clear our doubts and straighten our views. With a proper understanding of the Dhamma, we can now put it into practice. The right understanding of the Dhamma will produce right thoughts that, in turn, give rise to right action, right speech, and right livelihood. With such a right frame of mind, we can face the realities of life. May the merits punya be gained through listening to the Dhamma, discussing on the Dhamma, and straightening our views help us in overcoming any difficulties we may face. May all beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty powers, rejoice in these merits we have acquired, and may they long protect the Buddha's sasana. May this merit be a contributing cause for the realization of Nibbana. Idang me punya Nibbanasa pacayo hotu. And let's say salute to our two teachers, Brother Quay and Brother Rob.
Okay, the part is that teaching early Buddhist text is in with the Mahayana teaching of growth, but this one is not big.
Okay.
And art.
If a monk says the teaching based on the early Buddhist text, he's teaching the suttas, the Pali suttas. This is a Theravada term, early Buddhist text. He will be